Okay. So yeah, so maybe we'll kick off this time. I'm back with Beppe, and we were thinking of exploring a different topic today, which is, loosely the idea of uh, clients going out and trying something new or experiencing some situation in their life that they may perceive as having some level of risk, whatever that is. So we'll see where that takes us. Um, so, hi, Beppe.
Hey, hi. Okay, so whatever, I believe that a certain point that comes into the picture, whatever topic the client come to deal with or whatever issue, chances are is about something that they haven't been able to do, or they haven't succeeded in doing, or they didn't have the guts to do, or in different ways, something that has not been approached for one reason or another. Um, Now, working with the client, there is a chance, if everything goes smoothly, that the client would transition just and have a shift into doing something that we're not being able to do just naturally. Sometimes they can come back and just saying, "Oh, I did this, and I didn't even realize I was doing it." And so that's sometimes there is such a smooth transition, but not all the times. And there are moments in which the work done in the session at a certain point has to be brought out in the street, and things need to be experimented. And if there were issues, if there were resistance before, if there was something that was keeping them from doing something that they wanted to do, obviously they have to stretch their comfort zone there a little bit. Um, at that point, is I believe it's important to set up the terms of what they're trying to do, or the extent of the risks that they're taking, and especially to establish the fact that the success of trying is in fact just trying. They don't have to go through. They don't have to really get what they wanted at the first try, but at least to have had the courage of taking the first step. It might not go the way it's fully desired, uh, but what the success is to have tried it. And then eventually coming back, we can focus on what happened and break down the structure of whatever the action was and see whether we can operate in some parts there to make it better. What can we do to make it better? What can be done so that next time there is a better chance of getting through? Uh, so
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I would even go so far as to say that there's success in trying, and there's success even in noticing the thought that's preventing trying. And, like the idea of risk for me lets me know that the way they're perceiving a situation is that it has some inherent danger or concern or something. But that's typically a mindset, and even them beginning to notice that is, I think, is a huge step, and a great place to have a conversation
mhm.
in in the coaching. What's that, instead of just, if they're used to turning away, what's the thing they're turning away from?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, no, you bring a good point, and I believe that a very important aspect into this trying to face or to dare certain things that they couldn't be done before. Um, what is important is to develop the ability of be aware of what's going on, and like every step of the attempt somehow to bring that awareness in terms of what am I thinking now, what am I feeling now, because sometimes identifying those feelings and those thoughts, it's key to understand what is really keeping the client from achieving what he wants to achieve. And and sometimes because those things usually are all wrapped up in a little package. There is either stress, anxiety, and fear. But what is important is to open up that little purse and see what pops out. In the thoughts, also we can identify the beliefs that are there, and chances are that that's an issue. That there are limiting beliefs popping out. That there is an internal dialogue, which is often like a put down kind of dialogue. And so it's important to see how those things come out. Okay, so when they're out, then we can face them, then we can deal with them. If we can work on considering changing beliefs if they're limiting, we can work on changing or interfering with that negative internal dialogue. We can bring negotiation there. We can just basically the possibility are pretty much infinite. So, but the important things is that things begin to show up, and if things show up, then we can play the game.
Yeah, I think it's feelings don't come, for the most part, feelings don't come out of thin air. Feelings come from a particular way of thinking, of picturing things or saying things to ourselves, or like that internal dialogue. So that's an active process, even though it might be an unconscious process, and that's the way that the person is creating a sense of fear. And I think beginning to, like you said, open the purse and look at that in the calm setting of a conversation, that alone can begin to shift things quite a bit. Like to go, oh, look at this. Like what's scary about that? What's in that closet that's been hiding all these years? Okay, so we're back. So let me see, where were we? Yeah, it's for me, it's interesting, this idea of when does risk show up, and I think Robert Dilts was saying that the minute you have a goal, you have a problem. I don't think that was his idea originally. He's the one I heard it from. But the minute you have a goal, essentially, and if you're not there, then you have a problem. And I think risk sort of shows up in that way. If there wasn't any trepidation, like typically we would just go. I mean, sometimes you don't go to get whatever you want because maybe you don't know how. But usually it might be mixed in with some sense of, I don't know what's going to happen if I walk down that alley.
Yeah, and considering that there are all these thoughts and coming in the picture, so identifying is one part of it, and then once we are aware, another little thing to consider is where when we hear those thoughts, where are we putting our attention in? Because I believe that there is room there for some deliberacy in terms of a choice, what we decide to pay attention to or not. So even at that point, it's also useful to do something to develop ability to orient our attention where we want our attention to be, and that has something to do with, one can propose some meditative practice or some practice or some process that has to do with that. So the ability to deal with our focus and how we use our attention to our advantage or our disadvantage, and understanding whether we have choice there or not.
Can you give an example?
Uh, yeah, it is. Let's say that I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing. I'm experiencing a discomfort in whichever form. Usually, it starts with the feeling. It's not always that we're clear what the discomfort is about, but we feel a generalized kind of discomfort. Um, at that point, we might react in terms of I stop pursuing what I'm pursuing, or I let it go, or I do it with tension and anxiety. Um, and what's happening though is often we do not pay attention to what our thoughts are. So when I'm in that place of discomfort, what are my thoughts? So identify what's going on, really in terms of thoughts in that moment, and as a practical expedient, try to just think about something else. You really can choose where you want to bring your attention in terms of the thinking. The thinking. So eventually, instead of those thoughts running your life or running your experience, you begin to attempt to sit in the driver's seat and choose where you want to go in terms of your thinking. Sometimes, in fact, it's useful to have a set of positive, generative thoughts that you can refer to. And when you realize that you are in a bad spot in terms of your thoughts, that you can just decide to shift and decide very simply to say, instead of thinking that, I'm going to think this other thing. Uh, so, that is useful in the given moment and in the given situation.
Yeah,
Um,
that's, you
mhm,
know, it's interesting because a moment ago I was mentioning that feelings don't sort of necessarily, they don't show up on their own most of
mhm,
the time. There's usually a thought or some structure that's accompanying that. But you brought up an interesting point, which is very often we may not, our attention isn't on the thinking,
mhm,
our attention's on the feeling.
mhm,
Like, oh crap, I'm having this feeling, what's going on? And if you begin to bring awareness to, oh, I'm having a particular thought that's generating feelings in my body, that may begin, first of all, it might calm you down just to notice it.
mhm,
And then, like you said, you may begin to introduce some choice. Like, oh, I could think something else. Like last time we were talking about kind of building a safe space or some sanctuary, so that might be an alternative.
mhm,
Um, and you also brought up an interesting idea, which is sometimes we might notice something like I feel bad, and I'm still going to move forward
mhm,
and see what happens if what would happen if I made a habit of still acting even though I feel a particular way or even though I have some negative self-talk and see what sort of result shows up from that.
mhm.
I'm not waiting for this idea of waiting for ideal conditions before you act. I mean, you're going to wait a long time. I think. So,
Yeah, well, there are certain things also. Taking chance and taking risks is, as you are talking, comes to mind an experience that I had when I was actually very, very young and not at all aware of processing and what the mind goes through and so on. But my task that day, that morning, was to dive in a swimming pool. There was this swimming pool, and I would just sit at the edge of the swimming pool and seeing these people really having fun, going up the stairs and jumping down and laughing, and so at a certain point when they finished their stuff, I said, oh, you know what? It looks so much fun, so let me try. And so I go up the stairs and was probably like, I would say, 3 times my height. Um, so as I go up to the platform, I was not expecting the swimming pool to be so small down there and to be so far. So I had this reaction. This is like, I'm not going to do this. But then it's like the guys, they were having so much fun, and I wanted to have that. So
Mhm.
then at a certain point, I just stood up there standing and looking down. I realized that I'm not going to jump until I want to jump. That was one thought that kind of came to me. I don't know how. So I just was standing there and looking down the swimming pool, and I just stare at the swimming pool. And slowly and slowly, my perception went from going from perceiving and seeing how far away from I was from there, or the sense of vertigo that I had staying there, was like on the surface of the pool, and how the light reflected on this turquoise, beautiful water down there. And was like there was a pace, there was a rhythm. It became, all of a sudden, it became a beautiful thing. And then with that, my desire to jump into it grew. And the more I noticed the beauty of that little turquoise square with sunrise reflecting on it, the more I had the desire and the wish to go down. And finally, I did jump. And I felt my stomach go up to my brain when I was flying down. But it was indeed exhilarating, and especially after the splash, having done that was even greater fun than the main thing. So that was a process that happened just naturally. But that's a little bit what happens when I say we might notice certain things, or we might be up to something that make us really nervous and fearful, and uh, um, and just letting go of the thoughts, putting wood on fire for the stresses, anxiety, and focus on something else, something that whatever you're doing is promising. Something that obviously, if you want to pursue it, it must be worth at least that thought of trying to pursue. So emphasizing the appeal of what is that you are doing, going to the center of that, until that center is going to tell you something that is irresistible, and then you go for it. Um, Now, this is if everything goes well.
Yeah,
But that's what I aim. Uh,
I mean,
mm,
I want to be clear that primarily what we're talking about here is not encouraging people to do things that are inherently very risky.
mhm,
Exploring risk and doing something risky are two different things. I think one part of taking on any situation that we feel like involves risk is really making some rational assessment.
mhm,
That's a place where your logical brain is really helpful. Like, let's look at it rationally first and assess, like, okay, is this relatively safe, et cetera, et cetera. So we're really talking about all the things that we've come to realize are safe, like perhaps a job interview, or talking to a stranger. We know they're safe. We're not gonna die,
mhm.
but we're still getting frightened, perhaps, or still hesitating. Uh, and what I liked in your story is you paused and had an experience of being in that moment
Mhm.
and letting your mind wander instead of dwelling on the, oh shoot, what's going to happen if this happens and that, and et cetera, et cetera. Um,
Yeah, there is this interesting aspect about risk. Um, that usually as soon as we hear risk, we think about fear, we think about anxiety and all that kind of stuff. But we have also to take in consideration the thrill that risk can bring about. There is the adrenaline aspect of it.
Mm.
And then of course there are different typologies of people, and there is the adrenaline driven person that goes for the risk, and then the skydivers or
Mhm.
the snowboarders or whatever and but then they go for that because they do have courage, but the courage is not the quintessential element. The courage is a part. They get an amazing thrill out of doing that.
Mm.
It's just a pleasure and it's something appealing, and there is nothing better than they can think of doing for their own well-being, and they go and do it. And so they have, when we take risk in that way, they have a special they develop a special relationship with fear, uh, and and uh, and they're basically they're capable of embracing it. And that's truly what I believe courage is. Courage is not at all the lack of fear, because then what you're courageous
Right.
about, if I'm not fearful. So the courage is really the ability to embrace fear and to be able to catch the energy that that embrace can bring about, and in certain case, turn it into an exciting experience.
Right.
Uh,
And it's also not foolhardy risk taking. It's
mhm.
not, oh, this has a lot of adrenaline, so I'm going to jump off a building. Right?
Uh-huh.
It's well calculated. It's well practiced.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, to take risks doesn't mean to be reckless.
Right.
In fact, to take risks seriously is to be very responsible.
Right. So I think that's a really key aspect, is having some mechanism of, let's assess how dangerous this really is,
Hmm.
and what's a level of chance that I can take, right?
Hmm.
And get started. Like, what's one little piece that I could take on and see how I do,
Hmm.
and then maybe next time a little bit more, and so on.
Yeah,
Uh,
I have found also that there are different fields where the risk and the fear of acting is involved, and I found throughout years and experience, I found that every single person has in his or her life a place where they are courageous,
mm,
and they might be different. um, for example, there are many people who are afraid of public speaking, and others they don't.
mm,
So some people are afraid and will never stand out there and talk with people. Other that they really get a kick out of that. I personally enjoy with a given situation to talk with people, and maybe my experience as teacher kind of brought that kind of ability or so. But it's a real pleasure. And but maybe you can find a person who is totally comfortable talking in front of a public, and maybe he's very anxious about cooking,
mm,
because there is the belief that he can't cook or whatever, that he is not good at cooking. And then maybe if a group of friends are coming because they invite them for dinner, and then all of a sudden there is this task to approach. And so the same person in two different fields can be a very courageous person and a very cautious and reluctant in another field. So at that point, we can, since I believe everything is related or correlated, it's interesting to see what skills can I import from my courage to speak in front of people into my cooking? What can be useful? Is there anything, in fact, that I can import, both in the experience of being excited about doing something, and instead of the experience of being afraid and reluctant? This is basically discovering the resources that we have in different fields of life or at different times of our lives, and being able to import them into an aspect of our life where instead they're lacking.
Yeah, and it's, one thing I find fascinating, just one thing that I love about this work is that some things import really well and really easily, and some it's almost like there's a bubble around it, and it
Yeah.
takes some work to get it to move over. Like this one ability from this domain to move over to the other domain is kind of tricky. But I think you're absolutely right. I think there's always some place where the person is thriving in sort of a parallel context, where they're very bold. To an outside, somebody looking from the outside, it's like, oh wow, you're actually quite bold in this domain, and over here you're experiencing fear. And how are those different? I think another key question for me in this overall conversation is, I think very often people have a reference experience where they took a chance and they got burned. And they scraped their knee, something happened, they got embarrassed, they got ashamed, and then the body remembers that. And it can be tricky to unfold that learning, that kind of emotional learning. Because all of a sudden, like everything in that domain can seem scary. It was interesting when I was a crazy teenager. I tried to do a flip off of a high rock in my neighborhood, and I just thought, oh, I can do that for some reason. I don't know what I was thinking, and I jumped, and I pretty much landed on my head, and it was really like this shocking moment of, oh my God, and luckily I didn't really hurt myself, but my body knew that, and any idea of the thought of acrobatics really, like immediately I would tighten up thinking about that. And then over the years, I learned how to, I unpacked that a little bit to the point where I'm able to do those things now that my body had learned, like, don't go there. So,
those things can be processed eventually in life, and that's pretty much that's the tendency, whether we succeed on that or not. And because then the moment we start creating piece by piece evidence that is okay, maybe you take a step at a time to go and do something that we are not able to do. Or it sounds like you what you're describing is basically a form of PTSD. So there is trauma there, and there is trauma that has been kind of blocked somewhere within the system. Is in the physiology. It's there in the physiology of our body. It's in our brain, and so I believe at that point any approach that any kind of PTSD healing approach can be useful depending on the circumstances, and different coaches, different therapists approach that in different ways, and I find that either brain spotting or EMDR are extremely efficient dealing with something like that. But as I said, the important is kind of to be able to target the issue appropriately, and then whatever the techniques are used, I believe that can be helpful. And PTSD is something that is you don't usually you don't talk it off very in simple ways because there is more the rational and reasonable about it. So it has to be some approach that brings about a more emotional experience, and so it's like a non-linear approach to it, and stepping into the experience and stepping into the process, and just let it develop towards healing in a natural way. Of course, we talked before about safety, so doing that. Making sure that the parameters of safety are set up.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, you have to put on your seatbelt and your safety equipment.
Yes.
Yeah. You're not just going into the experience to collapse into it.
Exactly. Mhm.
Right. Well, good.
All right. Mhm.
Any other thoughts on risk and sort of encountering new domain?
Um, well, another aspect that comes to my mind is still I like the words, and I like what words express and the distinctions that we can make. So when um, we mentioned before, taking risk takes responsibility, and being able to measure the risk that you're taking so that you feel you're not jumping in the dark. That's just going to bring more fear, unless you're crazy. And making the distinction between risking and gambling, so that you just don't throw yourself, like either goes or doesn't go. I mean, of course, one can do that, but then we are already in a different kind of typology. But there is calculated risk is appropriate pretty much every time we are going to go for that stretch out of our comfort zone.
Yeah, the other thing that occurred to me is I think a lot of times people don't realize where they aren't taking steps,
Mm-hmm.
or where they are hesitating or turning away. It's easy to notice when it comes to something like snowboarding, like you were saying earlier, or some physical activity. It's very clear, okay, I'm doing this or I'm not doing that, and I'm not doing it because I'm feeling some fear. I think it's trickier in our lives to notice when, okay, I'm not going on a job interview, and to recognize that as a place where we're actually avoiding something.
Mm-hmm.
And then figuring out, okay, what are some steps that I could take? Like you said, not being risky, but what are some steps that I can start to build up to that? Um, I love this example of the guy David Bell who started parkour, where they jump on the buildings and jump around in the street. And I heard him talk, and he said something that really made an impression on me. He said, "I never take a jump that I can't do."
Mm-hmm.
He said, if I want to develop something, I might start with a very little jump, and I'm going to do that, hundreds, thousands of times, and then naturally it's going to lead to a little bit more. But he said it looks from the outside like he's taking chances, but he said he actually doesn't take chances.
Mm-hmm.
Everything he's done, he's like really built up to. And for me, that was like, wow, that you can build up to these huge things, but you actually have to start quite small. So,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
That's up for
Mm-hmm.
now. Yeah, we'll come back next time.
All right.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.